Hello everyone, welcome back to your anatomy class. Today we're going to be taking a look at the cardiovascular system. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system, this is actually a pretty well-known system. And although you might not know completely everything about it, we're going to see how the blood vessels and the heart are going to work together to be able to move things throughout the body. So this will be our beginning to like the circulatory system, but we'll start off by talking about the heart and its major blood vessels, as well as some other stuff like the electrical conduction system. So to get started, if you look closely, when we look at the words cardio and vascular, like those two terms you may have heard before, because when you say the word cardio, as in like if you think about cardio exercise, this is regarding the heart. So cardio means the heart, which is basically the pump of the cardiovascular system. And then vascular, the other part of cardiovascular, these are the blood vessels. So there are blood vessels that are going to be allowing the blood to move throughout the body. These are the tubes connected to the pump. So blood vessels are the tubes, and then the medium, like the stuff that's actually flowing throughout the heart, or rather the whole cardiovascular system, is the blood. So the liquid portion that flows throughout the body, this is the blood, and the medium. Now, the cardiovascular system, like with the pump, the tubes, and the medium, those together are basically allowing you to transport substances throughout the body, like things that need to be brought to the tissues, things that needs to be picked up and then gotten rid of. And then just in general, like if something needs to get from one place to another, like hormones or certain substances like nutrients, like you've got the cardiovascular system, which is usually going to be doing that. So there's some other types of transportation that we have, like a neuron and so on, but cardiovascular system is the place that you transport most substances throughout the body. Now, when we talk about circulation, a couple of words that are really important, especially one of them, is systemic and pulmonary. So systemic is the one that you probably may not have heard before, but systemic basically means everything else. Like systemic means like all throughout for the most part, like all throughout the body. This is the side that's going to be going to bring oxygenated blood to most of the blood or most of the body's tissues, like things that just generally need oxygen. So what you'll see is like you'll have blood vessels going throughout like all of your living tissues, your brain, your abdomen, your lower and upper extremities, and that's your systemic circulatory system. But pulmonary is a particular place that you'll have blood flow, which is the lungs. So pulmonary, that's where you're going to have blood flow to the lungs specifically, and that's a really important part, although a much smaller part, because this is where you have deoxygenated blood, like blood that does not have a lot of oxygen, go to the lungs, but then oxygenated blood come back to the lungs because this is where you pick up oxygen. So if you look closely at this diagram, like if we look over here, you have the lungs. This blue color is indicating that it's deoxygenated, meaning that there isn't a lot of oxygen. But once it goes to the lungs, like we breathe in air so that we can pick up oxygen, this is where you'll be able to get that oxygen and then return back to the heart as oxygenated blood. And then while we're at it, we might as well see that on the other side of this whole system, this is systemic now. And the systemic circulatory system, you can see has the red side, the oxygenated side going outwards to basically the whole body, your brain, your extremities, your abdomen, and then it comes back after delivering oxygen, deoxygenated. So it's a cycle of going from the lungs back to, or going to the lungs and back, going to the body and back. And it's a system of picking up oxygen and then delivering the oxygen. Now, we've been saying it a lot, but like the heart is actually more complex than a lot of people think. So this is what we're going to be looking at first. So to get started, the heart is basically a muscular sac. Like the muscle that you have in the heart, if you recall from our tissues, is cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is like every other muscle for the most part, although a little bit different from skeletal. And basically, muscles always contract. So while muscles contract, they shorten. And what that means is that when the muscles of the heart shorten, they squeeze the blood out. And when they squeeze the blood out, it goes into the blood vessels and it gets pushed forward. Like that's all the blood is, or that's all the heart is trying to do. It just fills up with blood, squeezes out, fills with blood, squeezes out, and it does that. I mean, hopefully all day, every day, forever, because otherwise, like your blood's not moving, you're not delivering anything, you're not picking up anything, you are essentially like not transporting what you need to. But to do that, there is an organization to the heart, and it's going to be four chambers. So although not super visible at the moment, there will be two top chambers up here called atria, two bottom chambers down here, which are called ventricles, and it'll be divided by left and right sides, and that's going to be important so that you have a good division of your oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. But we'll get into that later. But lastly, for the heart, you can see that it does have a bit of a shape. Like you imagine the heart being a certain shape, kind of like this, like a heart. But the heart, although it does have a little bit of that, it does have a point at the bottom and it does have these two parts at the top, but it is also slightly pointing to the left. But one last thing about the heart that's a little bit of a misconception is that a lot of people often think that the heart is like over on the left side of the like thorax, but it's really in the center, like right between the lungs in the like center of the mediastinum or at the bottom of the mediastinum. That's where you'll find your lung, or sorry, that's where you'll find your heart, right on top of the diaphragm. So right on top of the diaphragm, but also behind the sternum. So the heart is actually kind of like in the center, and it'll be like right between your lungs. Now, looking at the heart tissues and the coverings of the heart, we can see that we have a few major layers. So, oh, sorry. Let's keep going. If you look at the heart, you have a few major layers, but there's something that you can see like in each of the different layers, which is the word cardia, which makes sense because remember the word for heart is cardio. So looking at these terms, we actually have seen a similar organization. So let's see what other words we have here. Peri, epi, myo, and endo. So peri and epi, kind of like how we had layers surrounding the nerves, layers surrounding the lungs, like this is going to be pericardium for on the very outside, epicardium, which is going to be like on the outside of the heart itself, myocardium, myo, kind of like myofibril, myofilament is muscle, and then endocardium is going to be internal or inside. So if you look at these layers, you can see the big one in the middle is going to be the myocardium, the muscular layer, but then there is the epicardium and the endocardium, either on the inside or outside of this muscular tissue. Now, the last one is actually somewhat separate from the heart itself. Like there's going to be pericardium, but there's going to be visceral and then also parietal pericardium. So that's where we talk about our serous membrane. So let's go ahead and see the pericardium. So if you recall, like we have serous membranes, which will be a continuous layer, but it forms two separate parts. Like there will be a layer that's on the tissue itself, which on the organ is called visceral. So this is visceral pericardium. And then parietal pericardium is along the wall of the cavity, which in this case is the mediastinum. So this would be parietal pericardium. So visceral pericardium is the layer on the heart. Parietal pericardium is actually like surrounding the wall of this cavity. But once again, they do have this layer between them, or sorry, the space between them filled with a fluid, which is going to be pericardial fluid with inside of the pericardial cavity. But one thing to note regarding the visceral pericardium here is that the visceral pericardium is actually going to be the outermost layer of the heart itself. So in fact, that layer that we were talking about earlier, epicardium, is actually the same thing as the visceral pericardium. So those two terms are actually synonymous. So just be careful, but visceral pericardium and epicardium are actually the same exact layer. So like I was saying, though, you can see the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. The pericardial cavity is where you find the pericardial fluid right between them. So this is like a weird thing. I know we talked about this like in the very beginning of the semester, but just remember, like when you have this like these layers surrounding the heart, you kind of imagine it like a singular layer, like a balloon, in fact. And then if you put the organ, or in this case, your fist, into the balloon, that visceral pericardium is the part that's on the organ itself, and the parietal pericardium is the one on the outside. And then that space in between, that would be the pericardial space with the pericardial fluid inside. Now, this is important though, because like when you have all of these organs moving around in their cavities, there's like a lot of friction. Like any amount of rubbing, even if it's like slight and even if they are protected, like that rubbing is going to cause damage eventually. So we want to reduce that as much as possible. And we have the pericardial fluid that helps with lubricating these different organs and coverings to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, just to like run to cover the rest of the layers again as well, if you look closely, that or the visceral pericardium is actually the same thing as the epicardium. So same thing, but then this thick layer that you can see here is the muscular tissue, the myocardium, and then not very visible, but on the very inside, that's where you'll find endocardium. So the deepest part of the tissue, that will be the endocardium that lines the internal cavities of the heart. Now, a couple more kind of like major external or structures of the heart. I mean, first we can take a look at these two, which are some kind of like regions of the heart. The first of which is actually called the base. So the base of the heart is going to be where you find like the flat bottom part of the heart. This is going to be this region right here, where you can see some blood vessels, such as like the pulmonary veins, as well as the coronary sinus. And then one more thing that is connecting to the bottom of the heart would be the inferior vena cava. So believe it or not, like you don't have the heart like just sitting with the point pointed down. It's actually slightly, or sorry, for me, it's slightly pointed this way. And then there's a flat region right here, which is called the base. So this flat region right here is the base. And then the point, the apex, is pointed to the left. So the apex is down here, and the base is this whole area, which is kind of like the flat region of the heart, which it rests on when it sits inside of the thorax. Now, a couple more things to see on the outside of the heart, like although there are some stuff that we'll be covering later, like all of these blood vessels, arteries, and veins, you can also see these flaps of tissues, which are called auricles. So auricles, those are basically allowing the atria to kind of fill up a little bit more, or allow you to fill the heart with more blood than what it normally would. So it's just like an expandable portion of a couple of your different chambers of the heart. Now, just to give you a very brief rundown of these blood vessels, I mean, you can see that once again, there are red and blue, and then there's also going to be two types, arteries and veins. So just to be clear, red and blue is not indicating arteries and veins, but red and blue is indicating oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. But depending on the direction of blood flow, that's where you'll have different types of blood vessels, arteries and veins. So just having that in mind would be good enough for now, but we're going to get back to that when we see it later in the lecture. So let's go ahead and keep on going and take a look at our actual anatomy of the inside of the heart. So if you look at the heart here, you can see that you have these different chambers. And like we were saying, there are 4 chambers, 2 top chambers and 2 bottom chambers. So your 2 top chambers are called atria, and their big job, I mean, all they really want to do is fill up with as much blood as it can and pump it down into the body. That's all it needs to do. Just collect blood and push it down. Now, the bottom chambers, if you look closely, those actually have a thicker myocardium, especially the left side. But these 2 chambers, they don't have a very complex job, but a very important job, which is that these, made up of muscular tissue, will squeeze that blood out. So it squeezes the blood out, and that's where you can push the blood forward. So these are going to be called the ventricles at the bottom of the heart. So you can kind of see a brief schematic of like how this works with the 2 top chambers filling up, and then it just pumps that blood down. And then when the ventricles are pumped up as much as they can, filled up as much as they can, they contract and pump that blood out. And that blood, you just want to just keep on filling up, pumping out, filling up, pumping out, and that's it. Like that's the job of the heart. So to go over this specifically now, remember we have left and right sides, and it is slightly different from both sides. So let's go ahead and look at that individually. So the right atrium up here, this is going to be where you collect blood from the body. So from your systemic circulatory system. And when you collect blood from the systemic circulatory system, it has already delivered oxygen. So this is deoxygenated blood. You receive blood that is deoxygenated, and then you will be able to pump it out to the lungs eventually. So this is the right atrium receiving deoxygenated blood from the body. And what it does is pump it down into the right ventricle. So the right ventricle is going to receive blood from the right atrium. It fills up with as much blood as it can. And then remember, ventricles, it has one job, which is pumping the blood out. But remember, this is still deoxygenated blood. So let's just consider, if it is deoxygenated blood, where do you want it to go? So generally, if you have deoxygenated blood, you want to pick up oxygen. So where do you do that? The lungs. So going to the lungs, you'll have the right ventricle pumping the blood out through the pulmonary blood vessels to go to the lungs. And then after it goes to the lungs, it will return back to the heart at the left atrium, but now it is oxygenated. So your left atrium will receive oxygenated blood. That blood is going to have a lot of oxygen. It'll go, but all the left atrium needs to do is pump the blood downward into the left ventricle, and that's basically what it does. And if you look closely, this left ventricle is actually like the biggest one. Like it has the thickest myocardium, the most muscular tissue, because the left ventricle is pumping the blood everywhere. Like this is the blood that has to go up to your brain. It has to go down to your fingertips, down to your toes, all throughout your abdomen. So this ventricle is much stronger than any other chamber because it has to produce a lot of force to be able to go against gravity, to go into like small blood vessels, far blood vessels. So this is the one that pumps the oxygenated blood out into your systemic circulatory system. Now, there are some additional structures that are internal that we should look at as well, and the first of which are regarding the atria. So if you look closely, the atria are your 2 top chambers. But if you recall, you have these like flaps on the atria that are external called auricles. this right here would be the auricle, and on the inside of the atrium, you can see that you have these lines here. Those are actually muscles. Those muscles are called pectinate muscles, and they basically help with squeezing that blood down into the ventricles. So it's not going to do a whole lot because remember, it's not pumping the blood very far, it's just pumping it down. But just to make sure that you can fill up the ventricles as much as you can, you pump that blood down as best you can with these pectinate muscles. Now, one more thing that you can see here is like this little divot here or depression. And we've used a word for describing a depression in bones. And if you recall, that's called a fossa. So this, in fact, is a fossa, and this is called the fossa ovalis. So the fossa ovalis is something that you will be able to see because this is a remnant of where we used to have a hole in the heart. So when we are in embryonic growth, we used to have something called the foramen ovale. So we don't have this anymore. But the foramen ovale used to be a hole because it's just allowing as much blood flow to kind of go between structures within the heart and so on. But for us, we need a very distinct separation between the oxygenated and deoxygenated side, the left and right sides respectively. So in this case, we fill that hole and we cover it with this fossa ovalis, which is still here, but definitely separating the sides. Now, looking at the ventricles, there's a couple of things, or there's one thing at least that we're going to be looking at right now. If you look closely down here, there are these little irregular looking interconnecting fibers. These down here that are just kind of like going every which direction, those are called trabeculae carneae. But trabeculae carneae are irregular ridges, which are just helping to make sure that they do not um, allow the ventricles to get stuck together. Because if you have the ventricles get stuck together, like they really squeeze, and if they get stuck, that's not good because that means that they can't fill up anymore. So this is just helping to break that surface tension so that when they like squeeze together, they don't stick together. They will just open and close, open and close, open and close really easily. So something that's going to be a bit of a repeated pattern all throughout like this whole lecture and the whole circulatory system is that you just want to keep blood moving forward. You want to push as much blood as you can forward so that you can keep that blood flowing without like stagnating, basically. You want it to keep moving and transporting, otherwise it's not doing its job. Now, between your atrial ventricles, you do have these dividing structures called septa, and luckily, I mean, they're named exactly how you would hope they would be. If they're between the atria, they're called interatrial septa. If they're between the ventricles, they're called interventricular septa. So if you look closely, the interatrial septum is really, really thin, and this is actually where you'd find that fossa ovalis. So interatrial septum right over here, and then interventricular septum down here. So once again, you can see your chambers, and just to quickly review, you've got your two chambers on the top, left atrium, right atrium, two chambers on the bottom, left ventricle, right ventricle. And you can also see your trabeculae carneae, but you can't see the pectinate muscles because those are on like the inside of the auricle. But you can also see at least the interventricular septum, but the interatrial septum is kind of blocked by these blood vessels. Now, inside the heart, there are some additional supportive structures that help to allow blood to keep moving forward. And those structures are called valves. So, oh shoot, 1 second. Sorry about that. Now these valves, like if you've ever heard of any valves, these basically help with like opening and closing. And that's it. Like they open and close, and basically what they help with doing is just allowing blood to flow through in a certain direction, but it stops it from flowing back. So this keeps the blood moving forward all the time because you don't want blood to go back and forth. You want it to just keep going forward and forward and forward. So these valves do have specific names, but just to kind of get started, we have two major like types of valves, atrioventricular valves, and then we'll see semilunar valves. But atrioventricular valves, first of all, when you hear the word atrioventricular, what does that tell you? It is between the atrium and the ventricles. So look at either side and you can see, in this case, left atrium, left ventricle, there's a valve right here. This one is called the mitral valve. And then on the other side, right atrium, right ventricle, this is called the tricuspid valve. And when these contract, or sorry, when the ventricles contract, these will help with stopping the blood from going back up into the atria. Now we'll look at these individually, but looking at our next type of valves, we have semilunar valves, which will be after the ventricles. So if you look at either left or right ventricle, you can see the right ventricle here. This is where the blood goes up out of the ventricle into this big blood vessel, but if it doesn't have the force from the ventricle, like when the ventricle relaxes, that blood will naturally want to just fall down. And if it falls down, it might go into the ventricle, but in this case, the semilunar valves, and in this case, pulmonary valve, is going to stop it. Now, luckily, these valves are going to be named for the blood vessels that they go into. So this is the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary artery. So this is actually pulmonary valve. And then this really big blood vessel we're going to be looking at quite a bit is called the aorta, and this is called the aortic valve. So just to kind of go through them individually again, you have your right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve. So both of them are actually the same structure using different names. So if you see either, this is talking about one or like the same valve, and this is the valve between the right atrium and right ventricle. So this over here will be the tricuspid valve, and if you look closely, this is going to be right between the atrium and the ventricle. So this is when, or if the right ventricle contracts, it stops the blood from going back into the atrium and instead makes it go forward into the next blood vessel. So just to kind of like give you one more detail about this valve, when you see the word tricuspid, tri means three, kind of like tricycle. And in this case, the tricuspid valve has three little flaps or three little cusps. So that's why it's called tricuspid valve. 1, 2, and 3. Now the left side, or the left atrioventricular valve, has a couple names as well. Bicuspid valve. So in this case, use the same logic. In this case, bicuspid means two, like bicycle, two flaps for bicuspid valve. But there is another name that you might see and is possible to use. It's called the mitral valve. So the mitral valve will be over here. Same thing as bicuspid and left atrioventricular valve. Now, if you look closely, the left ventricle, or this is going to be on the left side between the left atrium and left ventricle. So it's the same thing where if the left ventricle contracts, you don't want that blood going back up into the atrium. Instead, it makes that blood go into the blood vessel instead. Now that leads us to our semilunar valves, which will be like after the ventricles. So this is where, remember, if the blood falls down, it helps with stopping it and catching it. So in this case, you can see right ventricle, and then this right here would be the pulmonary trunk, and this would be the pulmonary valve. So the pulmonary valve is just helping to make sure that this blood in the pulmonary trunk does not fall back down into the right ventricle. So this will be another valve to keep unidirectional flow of blood. So pulmonary valve, like something that I would like you to kind of remember as we go through like a lot of these structures, pulmonary means lungs. So if you ever see the word pulmonary, it's referring to the lungs, but we'll see that a couple more times. Now, aortic valve, this is regarding something that we haven't quite looked at too much yet, but this is regarding a very, very big artery. In fact, the biggest artery of the body, which is this giant red tube called the aorta. So in fact, I mean, at the very bottom and start of the aorta, this is called the aortic valve. So the aortic valve is down here, and this is where the blood goes through to go to basically the whole body, except for the lungs. So this is where it goes to the fingertips, to the toes, the abdomen, and then even the head and brain. Now, for your atrioventricular valves, there's a couple of different supportive tissues that we need to actually also cover, which are just helping to make sure that they don't invert. So remember, there's a lot of force being produced by the ventricles, and if it produces a lot of force, that means that I mean, unless it's very strong, that flap, those thin little tissues, might just open up. It's very easy for it to use enough force to just push it outward so that it just forces the blood out in that direction. But in this case, you have these muscles and little cords or fibers that help with supporting it. So in this case, when it tries to, or when the blood contracts, or sorry, when the heart contracts, the blood tries to go out here, but you have these little fibers and muscles attaching to those flaps or those valves to make sure that it is supported. It makes sure that it does not invert, because that's actually very bad. But if you look closely, the two things that you need to see here are the chordae tendineae and then the papillary muscles. So the chordae tendineae are these little fibers. Those little fibers are going to be attached to the valve itself. But then on the other end, you have these little bump-like muscles called papillary muscles. So you can see those little bump or cone-like muscles attached to those fibers. This is going to be able to contract to help with just pulling on those valves to make sure that they don't invert. So you really want to make sure that those valves stay in place. And if you do have a leaky valve, that's what causes something called a heart murmur. And in that case, that means that the blood is basically not moving forward effectively. And that blood can often that blood will be less effective in being able to deliver substances. So in this case, that's not good. So these valves are actually really crucial to make sure that the blood keeps moving forward. So to look briefly at the function of these atrioventricular valves, when the blood is going from the atrium into the ventricle, that blood just flows right through. It goes from the atrium down into the ventricle, and that's great because you're trying to fill up the ventricles with as much blood as you can. But when the ventricles contract, all of that blood is being squeezed out, but the valve here is going to stop it. But remember, you also have the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles pulling on this flap to make sure that it does not just bust open. So this is going to hold the blood from going back into the atria, and that means that the blood will need to go out into the blood vessels instead. So in this case, the semilunar valves will be open. That means that the blood can go out through them, and that would be your pulmonary and aortic valve. But when the ventricles relax, that means that the blood will fall back down, and this is where the valve will catch it. But this does not have as much force this does not have as much force when the blood is being just falling into to the blood vessels. This is where you just have the valves themselves kind of catching it and making sure that it does not go backwards. Now, an interesting thing about the heart, when you listen to someone's heart, when you've ever used a stethoscope like this thing, or you put your heart on someone's chest, you may have heard these heart sounds. It might sound like da-da, 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 but it's actually, or we do have a couple of names for those sounds, which is lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. But a lot of people think the heart sounds are due to the heart movement, the heart contraction, or something of the like. But the thing that's actually making those sounds are the valves. So every time that the that the valves snap closed. They snap closed every time it needs to. That's a heart sound. So snap, 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 snap. That's the atrioventricular valves closing. That's the first sound. Then the semilunar valves closing. That's the second sound. But generally, whenever you do hear those two sounds, that is when you have one heart contraction or one heartbeat. And just to give you a reference point, 70 to 80 is about the normal resting heart rate, although it definitely can get to 90 or even 100 for still relatively normal, or as low as maybe 50 or 40s for someone that's really athletic. But in general, the lower your resting heart rate, the better. So remember, let's just add in that new thing here. You got your atria and your ventricles, but you also have the valves closing. So ventricle contracts, atrioventricular valve, or in this case, tricuspid valve closes. And then after the ventricle relaxes, pulmonary valve or aortic valve closes so that the blood falls back down. And just if you'd like to, go ahead and review on this slide as well, but let's go ahead and keep on going. So looking closely, you can see that you have some blood vessels now. Now, although we're going to go into this in much more detail with the circulatory system, you can see that you have three major types of blood vessels. So the two big types that are transporting blood are called arteries and veins. So if you've ever heard of maybe the carotid artery or the jugular vein, those are examples of those blood vessels. But the big difference between arteries and veins is that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and then veins bring blood back to the heart. So, we're going to see different colors, and those colors are usually consistent with them, but there are exceptions, so it's not exactly a 100% pattern. But for arteries, it goes away from the heart. For veins, it goes back to the heart. And if you look closely, there are some other different structural differences here, but we'll actually look at that a lot more in detail with the circulatory system. But in general, when we follow arteries, it carries blood away from the heart, so they start out big and then they branch to smaller and smaller and smaller arteries. But veins, on the other hand, they start out small and then they join to form bigger and bigger and bigger veins. Now, one last type of blood vessel that's actually one of the most important are called capillaries. Because if you look closely at either arteries and veins, do you see how thick they are? There's no exchange that's going to be happening here. You need to get into these tiny blood vessels called capillaries, which is going to be really, really thin, and that is where you'll have any type of exchange. If you look closely, you've got red and blue here. That means that the red is oxygenated and the blue is deoxygenated. And then in these capillaries, do you see that it's turning from red to blue? That means that this blood is delivering oxygen to this tissue. That means that there is exchange occurring in these blood vessels. So these capillaries is where you're going to have exchange of oxygen, and then also you pick up other stuff like waste or carbon dioxide. So we'll get into that a lot more when we get into the circulatory system, but we do have some blood vessels that we want to look at. But just as a reminder, you see all these red and blue tubes, you've got arteries and veins going all throughout the body. And then furthermore, anywhere that you need the exchange, exchange, or generally wherever you have living tissue, you also have capillaries. You see all of these little blood vessels all throughout the hand and the face. All of your living tissues have tiny, tiny little blood vessels called capillaries. So although we'll talk about a lot of these big blood vessels, you always have tiny blood vessels coming off of it to allow for any type of exchange. But to start taking a look at these blood vessels, we're going to start at the ones connected to the right atrium. So the right atrium up here, you can see these really big blue blood vessels coming to it. These are called the superior and inferior vena cava. So remember, blood vessels that bring blood back to the heart are veins. So these are the vena cavas, superior and inferior vena cava, which brings blood either from the upper body, like upper extremity and head, or lower body, abdomen, and lower extremity. But both of them go to the right atrium. But there is one more that's going to go into the right atrium as well, and that is called the coronary sinus. If you look closely, you have these blood vessels on the heart itself. And that blood that's going into the heart, we'll talk about that. But basically, you have that blood returning to the right atrium through this little blood vessel called the coronary sinus on the back and bottom of the heart along the base. Now, if we follow the blood flow, we go from superior and inferior vena cava to right atrium, through tricuspid valve, into right ventricle, and then this is where the right ventricle leads through the pulmonary valve. And the reason why this is called pulmonary valve is because this is leading to the lungs. But to get to the lungs, there's two more blood vessels here. If you look closely, you have this singular structure. This is a trunk, the pulmonary trunk. And then the pulmonary trunk, like a tree, branches out. In this case, remember, going away from the heart, these are pulmonary arteries. So I want you to notice something here, which is that the pulmonary arteries are kind of purplish or blue in color because it's carrying deoxygenated blood. And I want you to be careful because usually arteries are red, but these pulmonary arteries are blue. So that's just something to be careful of and take note of. And then conversely, for the other side, if you look closely at the left atrium, there's blood vessels going to it. These are called pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins will go to the left atrium, which is then going to have oxygenated blood. So pulmonary veins come back from the lungs to the heart, and this is oxygenated blood going into the left atrium. And now let's keep going along our blood flow. You have left atrium, mitral valve, left ventricle, and then this is going to lead to the aorta. So the aorta is this really big red tube, and remember this was the aortic valve leading into the aorta. So aorta, I like to at least remember that it's an artery, and in fact, it is the largest artery of the body. So this is going to be really wide, and some people often like describe it as being like the size of a golf ball, in fact. Like there's going to be a lot of blood going through the aorta. You can see how really big this is. Because remember, what does the aorta supply? Everything except for the lungs. So it goes to the head, it goes to the fingers, it goes to the abdomen, it goes to the toes. Like it goes everywhere throughout the body except for the lungs. Now, if you look at the aorta, though, there are a few different regions to the aorta, and you can see that you have the ascending aorta going upwards out of the heart. Then you have this curved part above the heart called the aortic arch. And then the descending aorta, which technically will have two more specific names, thoracic and abdominal aorta, going down like the thorax and abdomen, basically. Now, looking at the aorta, specifically the aortic arch, there are a few blood vessels that we do want to cover while we're here. And if you look closely, right at the start of the aorta, you have these two blood vessels that are going to be branching off really, really early. These two are actually called coronary arteries. And we'll be looking at these more specifically later, but just to be clear, if you've ever heard of the words coronary bypass surgery, like these arteries are the ones that are affected during a heart attack often. And when you see these like blood vessels blocked, that means that you're not supplying the heart with blood. So that's bad. And those are the coronary arteries, but we'll look at those again later. But at the aortic arch, you can see that you have some pretty prominent branches. That's going to include this first one on the right called the brachus valve trunk. Then you also have the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian artery. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so your first one is called the brachiocephalic trunk. Then you have the left common carotid artery and the left subclavian artery. And you might be saying, why am I only saying left? And the reason for that is because you do have a right side, but there's some asymmetry here. There's something on the right side that you don't have on the left side, and that was that brachiocephalic trunk. So if you hear the words brachiocephalic, that means arm and head, brachiocephalic. And this is where you have the blood supply to the arm and head for the right side. So the brachiocephalic trunk goes to the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. So you have left and right sides, but notice that you have this brachiocephalic trunk singular on the right side. So there is a short mnemonic that you can use to remember these, which is your ABCs, and that goes aorta, A, B, brachiocephalic trunk, C, common carotid artery, and then S, ABCs, left subclavian artery. So in this case, I mean, you can see these branches coming off the aorta, and if you can just remember that you have that little exception here, like brachiocephalic trunk, that's a little different from the right side or left side. Now, just to reiterate regarding the size and importance of the aorta, do you see how big and long this is? And then furthermore, following it all the way down through the thoracic and abdominal aorta, this is really long. Like it's going to everywhere, like the arm, the head, the abdomen, the thorax, and then even the lower extremities. Now, to continue about our talk about the coronary circulation, remember, these blood vessels are on the heart itself. And also remember, remember these arteries and veins, they allow for the transport of blood, but they're not really allowing for exchange. So, even though there's a lot of blood flowing through the heart, and even though you maybe have arteries and veins on the heart, you need to lead to capillaries. And the way that you do that is through the coronary blood flow. So remember, coronary bypass surgery, that's like when you have that's what you get when you have a heart attack. And what happens here is one of these will get blocked. And that means that some part of your heart will not be getting oxygen and nutrients. And unfortunately, that part of the heart is going to potentially die. So the coronary arteries bring blood to the heart, but then remember you have that coronary sinus in the back that brings the blood back to your circulation as well. But we do have some specific arteries that we need to cover. So to get started, you have a left and right coronary artery. And if you look over here on the right coronary artery, there's two arteries that will branch off of it. The first of which is near the front and bottom of the heart, called the marginal artery. That is right along the right ventricle. And then if you look closely in the back, you have the posterior interventricular artery, which is right along the back, right between the left and right ventricles. So right coronary artery has marginal artery and posterior interventricular artery coming off of it. Now the left coronary artery also is going to be here, but notice that the left coronary artery is mostly kind of covered by the pulmonary trunk, but then there's also branches of the left coronary artery here as well, starting off with the anterior interventricular artery, which is sometimes called the left anterior interventricular artery or left anterior descending artery. So you might see those terms, but anterior interventricular artery is on the front between the ventricles, and then this one over here going along the side is circumflex artery. So if you've ever heard of the word circumnavigate or circumference, that's going to go around. So this is going around the side, the circumflex artery. Now, for every artery that you had, you generally do have a vein that's going to be running along with it, because wherever you have arteries, you need to have veins bring blood back from the heart as well. So if you look closely, where you have the anterior interventricular artery, you have the great cardiac vein. So great cardiac vein is on the front, and then the great cardiac vein goes along the back towards your coronary sinus. And that leads us to another one on the back side over here, where you had your posterior interventricular artery. This is, this is where you have your middle cardiac vein. So middle cardiac vein is going to be leading to your coronary sinus as well, and that's going to be where you had your posterior interventricular artery. Now, where you had your marginal artery, that's where you have your small cardiac vein. And then one more that's like not quite visible on this image, but where you had like the circumflex artery over on this side, that's where you'll have your posterior cardiac vein. So for every artery, generally you have like a vein that goes along with it. So just try to follow along if you can and look for an artery and a vein that are next to each other. But just to recall, you have the coronary sinus in the back where all of your veins go to, which finally leads to the right atrium so that you can return that blood to your normal blood circulation. And just as a reminder, like really important, do you see all these blood vessels? Like we talked about the big ones, but wherever you have exchange, you have these small blood vessels allowing for like that exchange. So you need to have capillaries to allow that to happen. But for the most part, we generally talk about the big ones that bring blood to certain areas, but all throughout the tissue, all throughout the muscle, you need to have a lot of capillaries to allow for a lot of exchange and a lot of drop off of oxygen and nutrients. Now, one more big system to talk about for like the heart is the electrical conduction system. And you might have seen this type of diagram before. This is called an ECG or EKG, and this is what's called an electrocardiogram. So depending on which part of the heart is actually being stimulated, it is going to then give you a certain landmark on this tracing. But something to note is that it is contracting in sequence. Like it's not like all at the same time. It's not just one big contraction. It's actually contracting one part at a time. And that's actually crucial for how the heart contracts. So let's go ahead and see that as we look at the electrical conduction. So something that you may have forgotten is that cardiac muscle is a little different from skeletal muscle. Like it is definitely fibrous still, but it is also Y-shaped. But then furthermore, it is going to be a little bit shorter, but interconnected by these things called intercalated discs. Now, these intercalated discs are really helpful because this is where you'll have these little like things called gap junctions, which allow for communication from one cell to the next, that allows the electrical conduction to go from one cell to the next and so on. So the cardiac muscle is going to allow the electrical conduction to go from one cell to the next, to the next, to the next, so that it's not just like nerves contracting the whole heart. It actually contracts and is stimulated in sequence. So to get started, we like all of the conduction, all of the electrical sequence is going to be starting at the sinoatrial node or SA node at the top of the right atrium. So this is where everything starts. This is where you have the sinoatrial node, which is what we know as the pacemaker. Now, this is going to generate the electrical conduction, which is then going to be sent out throughout the heart. But it all starts here at the SA node, which will then go out and travel throughout the atria to cause the atria to contract first. Now, if you look closely at least a lot of these fibers, those fibers are going to then start to converge at this next structure called the atrioventricular node. Now, we've heard the word atrioventricular before. What does that mean? It's between atria and ventricles. So at the bottom of the atria, the top of the ventricles, this atrioventricular node or AV node, this is going to be like where a lot of that conduction is going to actually have a short delay. Now, this sounds weird, right? Like, why would you want to delay this? And the reason for that is, once again, for blood flow. Because this short delay is going to allow the atria to contract fully before it gets down into the ventricles so that the ventricles can fill up as much as they can. So allowing that very short gap to allow the ventricles to fill up, this is where the AV node will delay that sequence. But from the AV node, it goes down this like these fibers called the bundle of His, and then down through these other fibers in the interventricular septum, the bundle branches. So the bundle branches will go down to the apex of the heart and then start to branch out into the ventricles, and those will be called Purkinje fibers. So Purkinje fibers are the ones actually in the ventricular walls, allowing the ventricles to be stimulated and contract. So you can see that whole sequence here just in fiber form: SA node, AV node, bundle of His, left and right bundle branches, and then Purkinje fibers all the way out here. So same thing, just look at it carefully. Now, just a couple things to bring up regarding, remember, the nervous system. So not going away, but you have two parts that are going to be helping to regulate your heart rate, and those are your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So sympathetic nervous system, remember, is your fight or flight. So think about that. In fight or flight, is your heart rate going to be fast or slow? Fast. So your sympathetic nervous system causes your heart to beat faster, and then parasympathetic, rest and digest, that's going to cause your heart to beat slower. Now, circulation is something that we've been talking about the whole time, but just as a reminder, like you've got your circulatory system going to your lungs and going to your body, your systemic and pulmonary circulatory systems, but also keep in mind that we have like a certain flow that's going through the heart and through the blood vessels. So let's go ahead and try to like remind ourselves of how this works. So remember, the atria fill up with blood and they pump that blood down into the ventricles. So that's basically the gist of it, but remember, it's also divided between left and right sides, and there's also valves that are going to be here as well. So if you want to like read this, go ahead, but I mean, I'm just going to kind of show you like the specific blood flow through the heart. So although it does happen simultaneously, it's good to follow a unidirectional flow and a singular flow for any blood. So you can actually start anywhere, but if you look closely, starting at the systemic circulatory system, you'll bring blood back from your body and go to the right atrium. What do you go through next? The tricuspid valve. So the tricuspid valve leads into the right ventricle, and then from the right ventricle, you go out through the aortic valve, into the pulmonary trunk, and then into the pulmonary arteries. And then pulmonary arteries go to the lungs, but then come back through the pulmonary veins, into the left atrium, through the mitral valve, into the left ventricle, and then you have another valve, the aortic valve, which aortic valve leads into the aorta. Now from here, you've gone to the body, and guess what? You're going to come back like at the beginning. So after it goes to the aorta, you come back again to the superior or inferior vena cava. So this is like the actual step-by-step flow of the heart. So if you'd like to, I mean, I would definitely practice like writing this down and looking at the structures, but these would be the pulmonary circulatory or pulmonary circulation throughout the heart. Or sorry, pulmonary and systemic circulation throughout the heart. So I think with that said, though, that should be just about it. So if you have any questions, let me know. But otherwise, thank you for listening. Good luck with your studying, and I'll see you all next time.